Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Now that the Biden White House has closed a chapter on its relations with Iran, what's next? Let's get to the bottom line. Relations between Iran and the United States, well, they've always been riddled with tension and drama. Former President Barack Obama reached an agreement to make sure that Iran wouldn't create nuclear weapons, but that agreement was then torn up by former President Donald Trump 5 years ago. When President Joe Biden took office, he wanted to rejoin that agreement, known as the JCPOA, and hired the same official that had reached the original agreement to negotiate with Iran, and that was Rob Malley. But a few months ago, Malley's security clearance was suddenly revoked, and now he's under investigation by the FBI. So what's really going on in Washington and Tehran, and are the chances for a deal and normal relations dead? Today we're talking with Roxane Farmanfarmaian, who teaches international politics of the Middle East and North Africa at Cambridge University, and Eli Lake, a contributing editor to Commentary Magazine, host of the Re-Education podcast, and a columnist for the New York Sun. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us. Let me start out with you, Eli, and ask you to set the stage. What I'm trying to understand is right now, as we talk today, what is U.S. strategy when it comes to Iran?
Well, it's hard to know what U.S. strategy is. There was, of course, the uprisings in Iran almost a year ago that started, you could say, in earnest in September. And the message from President Biden on down was almost a policy of solidarity. And yet they never closed the door on these negotiations. And so I think in that respect, it's sort of unclear. And then without Rob Malley in an active role in negotiations, it's unclear who is picked up, for him. And the Iranians themselves have not shown much of an interest in these kinds of negotiations, and in some ways have doubled down on an anti-Western approach by, providing drones to Russia in their war against Ukraine. So it's unclear what Biden's policy is other than a kind of holding pattern. One thing we can say is that when Biden came into office in 2021, the policy was not just let's get back into the 2015 nuclear deal. It was we will get back when the Iranians are in compliance themselves. And they never were able to get to that point. So is that still the view, that they will not re-enter the agreement until the Iranians are back in compliance? Have they been trying to get out of that? And what happened to Biden's solidarity? These are all open questions, and I don't know what the answer is.
Well, let me ask you just one further step, and then I want to go to Roxane.
Yeah.
But the question is, I remember very well hearing President Obama talk to the nation and basically say we were on a collision course with Iran, that without the JCPOA, without restraints on its nuclear weapons capacity and hopefully its capabilities, that the United States and its allies would be drawn into some form of hot conflict over trying to preempt that capacity being built inside Iran. So what is the state of Iran's nuclear weapons building capacity today, and are we on that collision course again? Eli?
Well, we know that the Iranians are much closer in terms of the enrichment of the highly enriched uranium or the nuclear fuel needed for nuclear weapons as opposed to energy, and they keep upping that. And we also know that they have installed more efficient centrifuges, some of which would have been allowed under the Obama deal. And we know that even if there was still, an Obama, JCPOA, that a lot of the limitations on how much low enriched uranium they can compile and other sorts of things would be sunsetted in the coming years. So all of that leads me to think that the Iranians are probably further along. But then, on the other hand, the Iranians have to sort of make a decision, which is that they have to worry about Israel and Israel's capabilities, and that if they cross a certain line, would that provoke a response from the Israelis, whether it would be covert or overt? So I think that that's a factor as well. But I think the Iranians are kind of where they've been. They're on the precipice of having a nuclear weapon.
Dr. Farmanfarmaian, I would also like to ask you your take on things, but I want to read you something. It's very interesting to read the intelligence report from the Office of Director of National Intelligence on Iran's nuclear weapons capability. And in it, it lays out a few of the things that Eli just shared, points of concern about enrichment levels and centrifuges and, capacity and kind of protected and hardened facilities. But that said, one of the most important lines is Iran is not currently undertaking the key nuclear weapons development activities that would be necessary to produce a testable nuclear device. So both of these are hanging together in the report. Some behaviors of concern, and yet this alliance. So I'd love to get your take on where you and I have been having this conversation now for a few years, but has anything fundamentally shifted in your interpretation of what Iran plans to do with its nuclear programs?
Well, I think it's quite clear that Iran has become a nuclear capable state. That's what's happened over the last 6 months to a year, and that its choice to become a nuclear state, a nuclear weaponized state, is no longer technical, but purely political. And it's clearly made the statement, or it's implied that it will not take that political step at the moment. So I completely agree with Eli. It is very unclear where things are. But on the other hand, I think it is clear that both parties are still willing to talk behind the scenes. They're not willing, either of them, to make something formal. But I think they do feel that both have vested interests to try to get somewhere in terms of an agreement that will reduce tensions, so that in the States, the election can continue unfolding, and in Iran, their efforts at reconstituting their economic woes will make some progress. So, and I agree with Eli also. I think they really want to take the tension off of any kind of real conflict with Israel, because we're seeing a deconflicting process taking place in the Gulf. And the one area of real tension is with Jerusalem and where that might go. So I think both sides are definitely open to still talking in the hallways of their various meetings where they may overlap. And it does seem that that is going on, but we don't have as clear an idea anymore as to how much, the phrase was used, less for less. And I think that's sort of where we're going at the moment, is less for less.
Why are we going that way, Roxane? I'm just confused, because about 8-9 months ago, I ran into Rob Malley, now suspended without pay and under FBI investigation, really interested in where that drama takes us. But 8 months ago, we seemed to be on the verge of getting back into the JCPOA and being on the verge of a deal. The view was that Iran really couldn't get to yes, that it wouldn't say yes. And I'm just interested in why that was. And now, as they're trying to put together a mini deal, and I'll just tell the public, this mini deal, or this sort of semblance of an arrangement, is being designed to potentially avoid congressional oversight or congressional approval. And I'm just interested in why the United States and Europe, perhaps, would be stepping back from a credible, tougher deal to something that is less, as you said, less for less.
Well, I think it may be a disconnect between what seemed like a very close arrangement in Vienna from the U.S. side or from the Western side versus from the Iranian side. I think the Iranians felt that there was still the desire they've expressed right from the beginning of having some kind of guarantee on that more formalized agreement that they all walked away from 7 months ago, that the United States itself would not walk away after this administration. And I think that is simply something the United States can't offer. There can be lots of fixes and promises and guarantees that are sort of minor that would possibly lead to it being quite difficult for the U.S. to walk away entirely. But the fact of the matter is, if there's a new administration elected, they can do whatever they wish. And I think that really was the major sticking point. So I think that's one of the reasons we're in the situation we find ourselves in now. And I think the situation is possibly gaining a certain degree of emergency to it or urgency simply because in October, a number of the parts of the JCPOA go into sunset, which includes the provision of drone and ballistic missile hardware and export to Iran. In other words, those restraints on its production will now be lifted in October. And that's a real issue. And the Europeans have indicated that they may not abide by the JCPOA. They may continue to constrain any kind of export of that kind of manufacturing into Iran, and goods and facilities, training, all of that. And Iran has made some very strong statements and implications about the Europeans reneging and saying that really then possibly will lead them to consider to leave the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there's quite a bit of rhetoric that's beginning to be bandied about, all of which is quite worrisome. So I think that's one of the reasons why the U.S. would really like to see if it and Iran can find some kind of backdoor, back corridor agreement.
Right. Well, Eli, this date in October, it's October 18th, 2023, these deals expire. Someone we both know, Steve Rademacher, has said that's a very important date. And when that date comes in, just as Roxane said, lots of restrictions come off Iran and its ability to export long-range missiles, which it has thus far not done to Russia. It's delivered short-range drones, but it's paying attention to these restrictions. And I'm just interested in what you think about Rademacher's point that we can't wait until that moment, that what has to happen is, you know, the best action would be for sanctions to snap back across the board and to create international illegality in Iran's weapons exports across the board. Would you agree with Rademacher?
Well, I mean, the Iranian regime in many ways is a lawless regime in a lot of other ways. So the idea that you'd be creating international illegality, I don't know that necessarily will factor into, will affect their behavior as much. I do think it's an important date. I mean, I think the other thing that we have to look at here is that the supreme leader of Iran is old and allegedly pretty sick, and we always kind of hear every few months of a story about some health scare or something like that. That's a huge matter of like who will be leading the Iranian regime in the next 5 years or 3 years or 2 years, and that will affect, I think, what the Iranians are willing to do. And also, I would always like to remind everybody who thinks about these issues that this is a regime that is facing a legitimation crisis, and it's been a long time going. And even though it's not as much in the news right now in terms of street protests, it's there in the background. There is a generation of Iranians that no longer believe in the principles of the 1979 revolution. I don't think that that we should necessarily bank on those people coming into power. That's not my point. My point, though, is that it needs to be taken into account that we're talking about a country that is ruled by a very corrupt and fanatic elite that no longer has the kind of backing that it did, you know, in the early days of that revolution when Iranians were still kind of responding to the years of the Shah. And, you know, you even see this interesting thing in Iran occasionally where you see posters occasionally of the old Pahlavi dynasty. So it's something I just kind of keep that in mind, that if you make any kind of deal with this regime, you know, we should think about how long that regime is going to be in place and how much popular legitimacy they have. Right.
Roxane, the death of Mahsa Amini, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, was a trigger. 20,000 in jail, more than 500 people killed, as Eli just talked about, street protests and lurking in the background inside Iran. I don't think that I or anyone I know can pretend to really know and understand the dynamics that are afoot inside Iran in any credible way. But I am interested in whether or not that is a dimension as we sort of look forward that you have an understanding with, so that people can look at both sides of this. Or the international deal making around weapons and ballistic missiles is one thing, but what Eli just laid out is a legitimacy crisis, a crisis about the social contract that Iranians feel or don't feel with their current government, and what can be done or should be done in taking that into account of the equation of how we deal with Iran?
Well, I don't want to be a naysayer, but it does seem to me that it certainly did trigger major demonstrations. The response was very heavy-handed, and it was something that I think certainly Europe and the U.S. and the West responded to viscerally. The killing of a young woman and the whole concept of segregating a part of the half of the population by insisting on veiling, and the kind of outpouring by the young people was extremely moving. But if we look with a hard, cold eye at the government itself, it did not actually flounder at all. There was no major division inside the regime. There wasn't it didn't trip as it went forward in its overly heavy-handed approach to snuffing out the demonstrations. And very unfortunately, we see that the demonstrations now have receded enormously. And I think there's a third part to this, and that is, I agree very much with what Eli is saying, but there is a third part, and that part is what has happened since, which is that the government has really operated on the foreign policy side, finding détente with its neighbors, with Saudi Arabia, thickening its relationship with China. It's joined the Shanghai Cooperation Council. So it's really made lots of steps trying to dust off its reputation internationally, show that it is a legitimate country and regime. And in fact, the newest information I just got today is that Iran might be critical in finding a negotiated settlement between Turkey and Syria. So we see that it is very active internationally, and that is balancing. That was a signal not only abroad, but to its own population to say, we are here, we're not going anywhere, and we are being taken very seriously by both the great powers and by our neighbors. And we have plans for the future, and we're going to be around.
Fascinating points. Eli, let me just ask you, again, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I think the United States right now is working very hard to try to seduce India out of all these arrangements around BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and some of the BRICS meetings. Is there a chance that somewhere down the road, Iran becomes the eye in BRICS, and that you basically have, a kind of different arrangement where, as you see, I don't know, a kind of counter-Western alliance that, and also looking at China's really active diplomacy in the region, as just mentioned, between the Saudis and the Iranians. Also, China's becoming a major trading partner with Israel. So what role do you see for China, and is Iran potentially going to become an economic partner of some of these countries that really want to resist American and European institutional dominance, if you will?
I think it's going to be very difficult unless Iran is willing to deal with some of the structural problems it has in terms of its banks being used as fronts for proliferation and terrorist financing, then they're going to run into lots of problems with international organizations that kind of keep the global financial system afloat. And, again, it's a question of if a new leader was to emerge post-Khamenei that was responsive to their citizens, and that would be great. And I think that it would be very possible to do a deal with the Iranians. But we don't know, and there's just a lot of uncertainty there. And, the thing that I'm watching is what happens after Khamenei. He can't live forever. So that's the thing I think that is worth watching. There were stories about, a recent kind of health crisis, I think about 7 months ago or something with him. He emerged after it. I'm not saying, but, you don't know what to do in terms of, you shouldn't report on rumors, but again, he's in his 80s, not the healthiest guy in the world. So I just am saying it's not a stable situation, especially when you start looking at it. And I would want to sort of see what happens after that. How are they going to adjust? And I would just say that I don't know that they afforded themselves, they certainly were willing to use violence to maintain power from this fall from nearly a year ago after the street protests. But there were moments that were touch and go, especially in some of the regional cities where we saw there was like video that came out on social media where people were saying that they were overwhelmed, they didn't know what to do. I would just say, anytime you're talking about an authoritarian system, everything looks stable until the moment it collapses. So there's a lot we don't see under the surface, and we should just always keep that in mind.
Of course, I should add that as we talk about Khamenei being in his 80s, of course, President Biden is also in his 80s.
Another one, yeah.
And so when you kind of look at that arena, but Roxane, let me just kind of get a take from you that when you sort of look at the region and you were to basically say, well, from this point forward, I remember when in our last discussion, Eli Lake said, maybe ambiguity is the right way to do it. Maybe the Israelis knocking off a nuclear scientist may be as good as it gets in terms of no plans actually working and just doing it. But I'm just interested that if you were advising the Biden White House and where to go, what would be the key pillars of what you think would be smart strategy right now for the U.S. and West regarding Iran?
Well, that's always a tough thing to be asked, if one is advising. And I think from my perspective, it always makes me very concerned when a country is really at the place of possibly being able to develop a nuclear weapon. And I also think the possibility of Iran's receiving long-distance missile imports and training and all sorts of elements that will, grow that industry is also very disconcerting. And in fact, they're already threatening. They've put their own restriction on the distance that their long-range ballistic missiles go so that they don't reach Europe. But now they're saying, well, that could change if Europe starts being tricky about exports. So I think the key that I would approach Biden and, in fact, some of the European leaders with is to really keep the eye on the ball, that this is a developing nuclear case. And although human rights and government legitimacy, and of course, Eli's right, government longevity are all issues, right now we have a policy issue that has to do with nuclear weaponization. And Iran has used this always as leverage. I think it's actually possibly, there's an argument to be said that it may have gone much further in the whole development of the nuclear industry than it had planned. It wanted to, I think, pursue the JCPOA originally. And so I think that it is now up to the negotiating team to ensure it stays within the NPT. Right now, it's still receiving a great deal of the nuclear watchdog investigations. It's open to several different members of that AIEA group going in and inspecting. Right. We don't want to lose sight. We don't want to have that turn black on us. And I think we need to make every effort to try to keep Iran's nuclear program open.
Always learn a lot from the two of you when we have these discussions. Professor Roxane Farmanfarmaian at Cambridge University and Eli Lake, contributing editor at Commentary Magazine. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks.
So what's the bottom line? From where I'm sitting, it looks like Iran has a strategy and the United States does not. America and its allies tried to rein in Iran's nuclear program, but there was never a real consensus propping up that arrangement. And now those who opposed it in Iran and the U.S. have killed it. Israel and many Arab countries view Iran as their primary threat, and they don't want a deal. Washington got close, but then Iran walked away. But with every day that passes, Iran is still making centrifuges and still refining uranium. So America is neither preparing for a military conflict with Iran nor reaching another deal to make peace with it. Instead, Washington's sort of pretty much doing nothing. Even though the Saudis have kind of sort of normalized relations with Iran, it was China who was pushing, not America. The global map of power is changing while the U.S. remains paralyzed. And that's the bottom line.